Hello. My name is Tatiana. I'm one of the artists and organizers of the 13 people that make up the collective Never Hit Send that have the exhibition downstairs, which will be open after the screening if anyone hasn't had a chance to check it out. And I wanted to introduce Parker Higgins this evening, who's going to be leading the discussion after the screening. Parker is an activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and specializes in issues at the intersection of freedom of speech and copyright, trademark, and patent law. He will be leading a short discussion following the screening tonight. Parker.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the organizers of this event. This is such an amazing space. I've never been here before, and it's really so great to be able to see so many people coming together to watch this film tonight. This film, of course, is by Laura Poitras. Laura Poitras was by no means unknown before this year. She won, of course, the MacArthur Genius Grant last October. I think rarely in the history of that institution has it been so obvious what a good idea it was to give it to somebody as Laura Poitras last October. Of course, it was through her work in making films like these that she became familiar to the security community and to the community of people that are working on government transparency issues and opening up, kind of trying to brush away the secrets that the U.S. government has really put in place all over with its policies. And it was through that, of course, this summer, or earlier this year, Edward Snowden contacted her, and what's led to such a vigorous national debate right now. Of course, this film comes from a little bit before then, but still, it's very much in the same conversation. What we've seen over the last, really since September 11th, 2001, we've seen the surveillance state expanding and a war on whistleblowers. It's a very dramatic war on whistleblowers. The administration before this one, but even more this administration, has really clamped down on what the public can know about what the government is doing in its name. And so in my professional capacity as an activist at EFF, this is something that we fight against. And after the film, I'll be talking a little bit about our efforts. But then just as an American, as someone whose tax dollars fund these kinds of programs, it makes me really distressed to see the way that they're used to carry out really abuses against human rights and against privacy that we all hold very dear. So I had a chance this September. I visited Berlin, where Laura Poitras has been. She's opted not to come to the U.S. anymore because for years she was stopped at the border, and her work was confiscated, and she would have to face these issues. And when Snowden came to her, she realized that it was just going to get that much worse. And so I had a chance to speak with her there. And the fortunate thing is that she is absolutely pursuing a full-hearted attempt at clearing some of that secrecy and bringing in transparency. She is in a community now of people that includes, for example, Daniel Ellsberg, who was a whistleblower of a previous generation, who's famous for kind of a catchphrase of his is that courage is contagious. And we've seen, in fact, through the acts of Edward Snowden and through Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald and many more, some of the people that are documented in this film have really faced very harsh personal consequences for their courage. Courage is contagious. And so I'll talk a little bit afterwards about what we're doing and what people can do, but it's really encouraging to see so many people out here tonight to engage with that conversation. So thank you. So just to bring everyone up to date, the law that was scheduled to be renewed last December was renewed last December against the protests of the senators that were mentioned and groups like EFF. It pushes back the time that we can really look at these laws again thoroughly another 5 years. I'm just gonna speak for about 10 or 15 minutes and then open the floor to questions. I want to talk about what EFF is doing, what other groups are doing, and what people can do. To start, I think the important thing to know about this level of surveillance is that it's robust technically, legally, and politically. And so any solution that we talk about has to address all three of these characteristics or risk not really having an effect. Just yesterday, Laura Poitras and James Risen, another noted national security journalist, had a story in the New York Times. I don't know why the New York Times published it on the Friday before holiday, but it talked about, published previously unpublished NSA documents that talked about a golden age of signals intelligence. So to the extent that we see this as a real problem that's unprecedented, they see it as a real bounty that's unprecedented. Snowden, when he first came out last June, said that his greatest fear of all of this was that he puts all the information into the public domain, puts himself at great risk, and then nothing changes. And I think that actually for a little while afterwards, that was a pretty widespread concern. But since then, the tide has turned a little bit. And we're working on changes in all three of those columns, technical, legal, and political, to bring about a real sea change, to make sure that Snowden's greatest fear doesn't come to be. So talking about technical stuff, really that comes down to more encryption and better implementation. And I've been really encouraged to see a lot of individuals, especially journalists, but really individuals across the spectrum, have taken an interest in their own privacy and the privacy of their communications. But what's really going to be the tipping point is when tech companies that provide the services, when they start to take encryption and privacy seriously. And we are starting to see that. And for the first time in recent memory, companies that are advertising to the general public are advertising on the basis of privacy, that our service will protect your data better. We've started to see, if someone asks a question, I can get into it more technically, but we've started to see real concrete measures undertaken by these companies. The companies have started to encrypt their data center links after we found earlier this, or I guess late last month, that was a point where the NSA was gathering data warrantlessly from Google and Yahoo. Companies have done more to use HTTPS connections, which really should be standard on every website across the web. It provides a layer of not just secrecy, but privacy for readers. They've implemented HTTPS better. Twitter just announced yesterday that they've got a characteristic called forward secrecy on their HTTPS implementation, and this was picked up. I mean, it's a technical change, and it was picked up by the Wall Street Journal and by the New York Times. This is things that really matter. And we're starting to see companies talking about encrypting mail between servers. And this is something where encrypting email from one person to another is very hard. Famously, Snowden first contacted Glenn Greenwald and said, "Hi, there's something I'd like to share with you. Can you set up encrypted email?" And Glenn said, "No, that's too hard. Like nobody knows how to do that." And so it was only because Laura had done work like this that he knew to go to her. So that's kind of the major technical column. The legal column, EFF has been filing lawsuits about NSA warrantless wiretapping for 6 years now. The programs that are described there form the basis of our first case. We had a whistleblower come to our office in San Francisco. He was an AT&T engineer, and he explained that he had seen the blueprints for a room in the AT&T San Francisco Folsom Street facility, that the room took all of the traffic through it and split it off. And so the traffic went through, and a copy of it went somewhere else. And so that formed the basis of a lawsuit that we filed in 2006. In 2008, Congress passed a law retroactively making AT&T and other telecoms immune from lawsuits. which, in one way it's flattering to get Congress to pass a law to make your lawsuit null and void. But it's also really frustrating. Immediately we switched to suing the NSA over this, and that case is still ongoing. Since the June disclosures, we have a new case out that is focused on the First Amendment. So people understand the privacy and the Fourth Amendment relationship, but the First Amendment includes the freedom of association, the right to form groups and to talk with each other. And there's strong case law in the books that says the government can't force these groups to give up their membership lists. And by collecting the metadata, the channels of communication between everybody, even if they don't touch the communication itself, that is, as Binny described, that domain connects these groups. And so we've got, that's called Unitarians v. NSA. We've got that church and 21 other groups that really run the political gamut, fighting back against that. ACLU, who was featured in this, have cases. They had one dismissed by the Supreme Court. They heard it last October, and it was dismissed in January. It's the basis of that case is now they can basically bring it again with new evidence that was released in June. And also we've filed suits under the Freedom of Information Act. So for years we've been filing these Freedom of Information Act requests to get what the Department of Justice, what their interpretation of the law is. They say they don't have a secret law, but they don't tell you what they think the law means. So they're following a law that only they know. And as Bamford described on the panel here, they redefine words. And so they say, no, we're not capturing anything because, okay, sure, it's in our database, but we're not listening to it. And things like that really it's word games, and it amounts to a secret law. We are winning these FOIA cases, and we are consistently forcing the Department of Justice to release FISA court rulings. Every time this happens, the Director of National Intelligence issues a press release and says that in the spirit of transparency, we've decided to release these new decisions. And every time it's because they've been forced to by a lawsuit. So next time you hear the ODNI say that, it's because it's EFF and other groups have filed those lawsuits. And then finally, the last column is political. And this is in part legislative and in part much bigger than that. It's that the NSA, they're the largest employer in Maryland, for example. They've got a lot of political clout. But they've really seen, again, the public opinion turn. For the first time since Pew started conducting these polls, Americans this summer said that they're more afraid of threats to their civil liberties than they are of the threat of terrorism, for the very first time. In the beginning, after these leaks started, the Amash Amendment, which was it was an okay amendment that was aimed at defunding some of these programs. It came within 12 votes of passing in the House, which is huge. It was considered a fringe thing, and then ended up being, nothing passes in this Congress. The New York Times has been, since the middle of this summer, calling some sort of reform inevitable. Dianne Feinstein, Senator Feinstein, who has been one of the largest apologists for these programs, has come out and said, okay, in some places they've gone too far. She has also introduced a bill that she says fixes things. I encourage you to read more on that. It does not. There are several bills that have been proposed. The Feinstein bill is a fake fix. It codifies what the intelligence agencies have been doing, but doesn't do anything to reform them. So sure, it brings it within a more sane interpretation of the law by changing the law. So that's not what we want to see. There has been one proposal, and this is again just legislative, that has gotten a lot of people's attention. It's the author of it is Sensenbrenner, also the author of the Patriot Act. This is a person with whom, at least at the EFF, we don't often agree. But he proposed an act called the USA Freedom Act. Like the Patriot Act, USA Freedom stands for something, like it's forced in. But okay. And it actually introduces some really important changes. We're considering it a floor and not a ceiling. These are the start of changes. But some of the things it does is it makes the FISA court more transparent. So the FISA court is the one that was created by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and was renewed with the law discussed at the end of this. It introduces a special advocate for civil liberties. Currently, the FISA court, it's called a court, but it doesn't function like a regular court because only one side ever shows up. Only the government gets to make its case. And they say, we need to be able to spy on Americans this way. And there's no American there saying, no, wait, no, you don't. So this introduces a special advocate for privacy. Again, it's not a perfect fix, but the bill also introduced new statutory limits on what is allowed to be collected. Things it doesn't address any of the tech problems that we've seen that have come out in things like the NSA deliberately weakening encryption that Americans use. It doesn't touch one of the authorizations under which the NSA is conducting this surveillance is an executive order, Executive Order 12333. It doesn't address that. That needs to be addressed further. It doesn't work on it doesn't do any work on the general problem of overclassification and the ability of the government to use a state secrets privilege to squash court cases. And we've actually again, EFF's lawsuits have been the longest standing, but other lawsuits have come up against this issue where they've got a legitimate lawsuit. And the government says, even by litigating this, even by saying whether or not we agree with your claim, that would be revealing a state secret, and we can't do that. And the other thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't provide any sort of public accountability for the employees and the agents and the executives who are breaking the law right now by running these programs. And that's something that really, as far as I'm concerned, we need to see accountability for these public officials if we expect the program to have any kind of legitimacy. One more thing is that all of the changes that I've described legislatively are aimed at protecting Americans from surveillance. It's recently come to my attention that there are some people who are not American. So these people have rights too. It doesn't. The right of privacy doesn't stop at the U.S. border, and so some of our technical changes, of course, would raise the privacy tide for everybody. We've also led an effort that now has 300 NGOs signed on from across the globe that has laid out 13 principles of how the human rights, the global human rights law should apply to domestic surveillance, and it should, in fact, restrict it much further than it has. We have sent a letter to the UN General Assembly to adopt these 13 principles. There's recently been a report that the U.S. is very vigorously pushing to not allow privacy in the digital space to be accepted as a human right because it would interfere with their surveillance programs. Fortunately, we've seen other countries push back, especially as we've heard word over the summer that these programs are targeting executives in those countries. Very famously, the Chancellor of Germany's cell phone was tapped. In another example of the really heinous word games, they put out a statement that said, "We're not tapping it, and we're not going to tap it." And people said, "Well, did you tap it?" And they said, "We have no further comment at this time." And so we're actually seeing a push for reform. So these are all areas where the lawsuits we're working on, but from a technical perspective and from pushing your elected legislators, these are things that people can actually do today, and that the tech companies and the legislators really need to hear from you. So those are the biggest areas where people can get involved, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'd like to open up the floor for questions. So thank you. Yeah, if you could speak in, if you don't mind.
I was just wondering, are there any groups or populations in the U.S. that are being listened to or spied on more than others, or is it everybody the same?
We have reason to believe that there are groups that are targeted more. Through other FOIA requests and other lawsuits, we found that, for example, the DHS does, so the NSA does one branch of surveillance, but of course the FBI and the DHS are doing their own branches of surveillance. The DHS operates 70 what are called fusion centers that they're similar, smaller in scale to the Bluffdale Center that we've seen, and they collect data from a bunch of different sources. I've seen reports that have been, there are public reports that have been issued to this. They're called suspicious activity reports, SARs. Some of these reports say suspected ME at such and such location. ME means Middle Eastern person, suspected. And so we've seen all sorts of examples of this. One of the major cases that had been advancing for a while was one of the only cases before this summer that had standing. In order to have standing, you need to demonstrate that the government has surveilled you. That's what stopped up the ACLU case before, because they said, well, they brought people, they brought as plaintiffs people who had been working as lawyers for people who were being charged with terrorism overseas, and they said, come on, if you're surveilling anybody, you got to be surveilling these people because you're bringing charges against them for terrorism. So you must be surveilling our conversations, and that was thrown out by the Supreme Court. But one of the other cases that wasn't was a group that was accidentally, they had made a FOIA request and they were given too much, and they were given evidence of the government surveilling their conversations. And that case is called Al Haramain, and it was a group that focuses on Middle Eastern issues. And so there are dragnet programs that really get everybody, but there are lots of ways in which this is especially a problem for groups that are historically disenfranchised. Is there another question? In the back? You're going to have to yell, I guess. It's.
I have a microphone here, too. So you mentioned the about First Amendment protection around the freedom to assemble, and a lawsuit around communities and like some protections around community. Is there special protection, at least on privacy, for community, or is that the theory? Like, can you expand on that?
Yeah, the case is NAACP versus Alabama, and it was specifically the law enforcement in Alabama that was requesting the membership records of the NAACP chapter there. And so it was really, an important thing here is that the government doesn't distinguish which of these groups merit this sort of protection. The point is that you get these protections just by nature of, everybody gets these. It's First Amendment protections across the board. And so we've chosen, we've got 22 plaintiffs in this case, and they range from, we've got, the title of it is Unitarian, so it's a church group, and of course there's strong protection for churches also based on the First Amendment. But there are political groups, there are, I think, 2 different gun rights groups, and really the point is that every group has this, and there's no distinction in the case law around NAACP versus Alabama that it's because it's a community organization or any kind of organization in particular. Looks like there are many questions now.
Hey, I feel like in a lot of these discussions, the technologies that get mentioned the most are the sort of like populist internet stuff, like a lot about web traffic and a lot about email. Is there a sense, do we know like how much like other technical infrastructures may or may not be implicated in surveillance stuff like ATMs or, cell phones, like Benny was sort of, yeah.
Yeah, we've learned more about that this summer. It really is, the NSA charter has changed. Not the document itself, but the idea that it's now, if there's information out there, they're going to try to collect it. And so we've learned a lot of things about financial transactions, for one thing. Of course, there's phone records, which isn't strictly email or internet. And then when we're talking about these internet programs, they're actually tapping the fiber, the backbone of this. And so In a sense, it's internet like it's websites, but it's also all sorts of communications that travel over IP, which is, I mean, in 2013, it's virtually everything. And so there are these different domains, and I think that's what Binny was getting at there, that they do have financial transactions. There's some evidence that it's credit card transactions. But it really is, it doesn't seem, I mean, even this summer, if it weren't the summer of Snowden, the story that in fact the U.S. Postal Service runs a program called the MICT, the Mass Intercept Communications something, where they scan a copy of every envelope that goes through and retain it for who knows how long and give it up to kind of any law enforcement agency that asks. That would have been the biggest story, the biggest privacy story this summer. It went under the radar, basically. It was used to remember there was that weird story about the Elvis impersonator that sent a pathogen in the mail to Obama or something. Yeah, it was not the Elvis impersonator, and they found out because they just checked the mail that was before and after it, and it's like, oh, you can do that. And so it's really at this point the assumption is, if it's out there, they're trying to tap it. Sure. So should we? Is there like maybe a system where people should try to go up to you? This is my dad, everybody.
In considering the government of a place as distinct from the population of a place, is there any one or more governments around the world that is more or less rising up in the same spirit as in the opposition to invasions of privacy? If so, like, which ones are the greatest allies in this respect?
So that was there was towards the end of the summer, there was a press release issued by the ODNI that said something along the lines of, "We know what Snowden has now. He has information about what other governments are doing, and so." And this was between the lines. Be careful about how sanctimonious you are about what the U.S. is doing, because in fact, it really looks like it's governments all over the world. A lot of the documents are marked Five Eyes, which are the five like English-speaking countries that share intelligence with each other. But a recent report said that there's also like an 8 Eyes and a 13 Eyes, and there are all these different information sharing programs. And this is historically one of the ways that they get around restrictions on domestic surveillance is they have the UK's GCHQ do the surveillance on Americans and then ask them for it, so they don't have to conduct the surveillance themselves. But I haven't seen there's a person in Parliament in Germany, Hans Christian Strobele, who has met with Snowden, and he's pushed back hard, but he's not in the majority party. There are people in Iceland who are working hard on this, but Iceland doesn't have the kind of population to sustain an intelligence program like the NSA. And there isn't. It really does appear that there isn't. This isn't the U.S. versus everyone. This is the governments versus people in a lot of ways, which is alarming. Thank you.
Hey, do you feel like bringing these issues into popular culture by like authors like Cory Doctorow and stuff like that, do you feel like that's raising the profile of these issues in general, or do you feel like maybe it's trivializing those issues by fictionalizing them and injecting them into pop culture?
I definitely think it's raising the profile, and I think that's something that just personally, that's something that art seems to. It seems that art used to do that a lot more, and that's one of the reasons why I really like this this particular show, is that it's about that. I think Cory Doctorow in particular, it's barely fiction. He takes out glue and sticks together all these news stories, and then it's a novel. But I do think that if you really, our best source of explaining why this is problematic over and over is that it's Orwellian. and we wouldn't have that if Orwell didn't write about it. It used to be that you could say this is something the Soviets would do, or this is something the Stasi would do, which doesn't, there are people who grew up, and that's not a point of reference. And so I think it's actually really important that artists engage with this, and that artists bring it into popular consciousness.
You mentioned legal, political, and technological as the three categories of analysis and countermeasure for those who want to counter this trend. What about economic? Because it seems that there is tremendous economic benefit in the commercial sector and then for private individuals to be derived from these technologies. That seems like it would be a strong incentive to further develop these capabilities.
I think that, and I don't want to sound cynical here, I think economics is the only thing that's going to make the other columns move. And we've seen companies compete on privacy because they're losing business if they don't. And we've seen companies that are not based in the US have said, our servers aren't in the US, so you can trust us to try to defend, we're not subject to US court orders. That is going to be the engine that moves technological changes. And it's going to be the Googles and Twitters and to some extent Facebooks that are feeling that crunch that get the ears of lawmakers. And I still have some faith in that third column of legal changes, that a judge shouldn't be influenced by that. But at least in the other two, absolutely economics is sort of where it hurts and where we're going to see changes.
I was just thinking about the encryption as a way of protection. It just seems problematic in that it's a reaction to security and secrecy with more security and secrecy.
Yeah, so the one component that makes it problematic is that modern encryption makes this better, but you're still doing your own security against a $50 billion a year adversary you're going to have a bad time. So it's problematic in that way, but I strongly believe that individuals should seek to have privacy and institutions should seek to have transparency. That the real problem with official secrecy is that it's part of a power imbalance. And there's going to be a power imbalance between the government and the people. That's a definitional thing. But privacy and tools that enable secrecy in the hands of the people helps correct that. And then the other thing that it does is really, I don't want to sound like a downer. I keep giving this talk and keep being a downer. But if a $50 billion a year adversary wants your email, they're going to get it one way or another. I mean, even if you're doing super elite hacker crypto, if they can shine a laser at your window and record your keystrokes and do audio analysis on that, whatever. They've got $50 billion a year. So this is not about making sure that your communications are absolutely secure. The point is making it so that they cannot do the kind of dragnet, suspicionless surveillance that they've been able to do, and that's really the counter to the idea that this is enabling a going dark or facilitating criminal activity.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could think a bit broadly about the relationship between NSA surveillance and a corruption of domestic law. So there was a report earlier this summer in which the DEA was building cases backwards from information, some of which was received from NSA intercepts, and they were able to construct cases that from the outside appeared to have been done above board, but in fact were constructed with information that they wouldn't have had access to without it. So I'm wondering, kind of broadly, think about the relationship between something that seems international and domestic legal processes that we believe will protect us but are being corrupted.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important connection to draw. And I don't think that we can have a massive state surveillance apparatus that's operating in the shadows that has no accountability, and then also think that the rest of our legal apparatus is going to escape unscathed. The NSA, another report later this summer, so that was the parallel construction story. Another report later this summer talked about the different, and this is NSA jargon, the different customers of NSA data. And it was groups like, that range all over the government to like the US trade representative. And it's like, what's the US trade representative need with like signals intelligence? That doesn't, this is absolutely, I mean, any member of the public who looks at this can recognize that's insane. And they've gotten away with it by not allowing any member of the public to look at it. And so I think people sometimes misuse the phrase, the cliche about bad apples. The idea is that bad apples actually infect the other apples. And I think that's what we're seeing, that the NSA can't be a rotten apple in the bottom of the barrel and leave the rest of our system intact.
So it seems to me that the timeline of the revelations about the NSA was really unlucky in that it coincided with the financial crisis. And so getting people to care about stuff like the NSA is really difficult when everyone's losing their jobs and their houses and stuff like that. But it seems like one of the interesting things to come from the financial crisis is a greater push for transparency in the government. And I'm wondering if you guys, on one hand, see a way of like taking the frustration with the financial crisis and finding a way to like aim it at NSA issues, and if so, like how have you been working on that?
Yeah, I think it is an unfortunate confluence of things, but I don't think it's coincidental. I think that it comes from the same power structures, and it comes from the same systems that allow secrecy at a very high level. And a general lack of accountability. I haven't seen any really great. So there are people who are. It's a little bit outside of scope for what we're doing in our lawsuits and such. But there are people who are making a much stronger case about how surveillance is not a quote privacy issue, but a social justice issue. And I think that's a really important thing to get across. I think a lot of people care about their privacy, especially in the abstract, and especially when they can see the harms. But when you're talking about the kinds of invasions that really pervasive surveillance allows, it ends up being a social justice problem and a human rights problem. And it exacerbates all the things that the financial crisis, all the imbalances that the financial crisis has really brought to light. And so we haven't done as much as I would like, and I'd be interested to see more ideas about how to channel that energy.
Hi. So I'm kind of curious as to what you're more scared of, like corporate America selling culture and progress to citizens, or an authoritarian government, selling the idea of security, and like where do they overlap? You kind of hinted at that with the trade commission or something. I'm wording that wrong. And also, what do you say when people say that doesn't matter, or it's? I'm kind of worried about advertising here and how they're going to get us with better tactics to sell us stuff. Yeah,
well, these are absolutely one and the same issue, and a thing that's changed about the character of NSA surveillance in the past 15 years is that increasingly they go to just pools of data that have been collected by corporations. So they don't have to do active surveillance. They just go to Google and they give them a secret court order and they say, we need all the information on this guy. That's a huge problem. That's a major problem. And to be frank, you can't fix the state surveillance problem without first addressing the corporate surveillance problem. And there are patches you can make. You can try to outlaw certain partnerships. But really the issue is that we've created these databases. Paul Ohm, who's a privacy scholar, he was recently working for the FTC. He calls them databases of ruin. That if you connect enough of these databases, you can't undo them, and they're useful beyond the initial purposes, or the intended purposes. And this is it's something that sometimes people in the privacy world split up for government and consumer stuff, but it really is, there's a major overlap. And getting people to people really like, in some cases, their Google or their Facebook or their Twitter, and they like the media companies that rely on advertising. And this is going to have to be a systemic change. And we started to see that. I mean, I can tell you that the opinion of a company like Google is, it's not as high now as it was last year, and that's in part because of the concerns that people have, and it may be that people notice this more when it's not just their privacy that's being infringed, but their autonomy, when they feel like they're being when they have ads shoved in their faces. But this is something that has to change, and it's beyond what we're talking about tonight, but it's absolutely connected.
I'd like to go back to your formulation about valuing privacy for individuals and transparency for institutions, and to ask whether you have any concerns of that the rights of privacy you're seeking for individuals will be extended to other things that like corporations, for example, and where you draw the line of, the lawsuit that you have with the Unitarian Church, that's an institution, as it were, but you're also seeking privacy for that institution. So what institutions should be conferred the rights of an individual, and why do you pick the individual as the one that has the right to privacy? Where do you draw that line between?
So, and that's a power discrepancy thing. In this case, a church or a guns group or whatever. There are 22 plaintiffs, and I only remember those two. They are absolutely in a power imbalance with the government, and so they need to be able to help remedy that with privacy. And that's privacy for their individuals, for the members that make up. And so the member list is really, it's technically something that the institution maintains, but it's a list of individuals. Sorry, I forgot the first part of your. Sure. Well, I think it comes down to, I think the first question you have to ask is, what's the power relationship here? It maybe wouldn't be the question that I ask a congressional staffer or something. It's a little bit more philosophical, but you can see when you see the same thing when you're talking about ad networks that are engaged in shady activity. When they're tracking a person across websites, that ad network is it's an organization, it's a corporation, but they should absolutely be straightforward about that, and it's a nature of the relationship between those two, between the two people. I think that it's especially telling that there's people miss that when and fortunately I've started to hear this less, but people say, well, I've got nothing to hide, so why should I be concerned about this? And to those people I want to say, well, if you associate secrecy with wrongdoing, if you think, oh, I should only have secrecy if I'm in the wrong, how could you possibly tolerate a $50 billion a year program that no one gives you any details about? This is really, it cannot possibly be consistent. And so I think that in many cases it's very easy to figure out what the power relationship is, and if there are edge cases, then I probably default to more transparency. But in most cases, I think individuals in their individual capacity should be afforded privacy because that's a human right. Yeah. Well, so I'm picking sides. I'm on the side of individual empowerment, not authoritarian, like the crushing of the individual. And sure, difference of opinion. But yeah, I think that if the NSA says, well, we should be allowed secrecy and nobody else on the planet should, I think they are wrong. And you know, that's I don't know how to get more into more firm than that.
First, a comment about the advertising side of things. I think it should not be underestimated the pressure and incentive and motivation that the many billions of dollars of profit that stands to be gained from those activities. I don't think it's just wanting it to go away is probably not going to be sufficient, considering also that many individuals derive benefit from those services. So I think that there is a significant, I don't know, PR, but whatever it is. Because I would imagine that a lot of people in this room have probably updated their social networks about this fantastic event and so forth, just as an example of feeding right into those entities. Now for my actual question, which is, I guess, kind of a comment too. During the Cold War and the development of strategic nuclear weapons, there was a very strong secret component to it, although there were some very visible events like nuclear testing that, but there was a very clear threat posed to the population of the United States and the global population in nuclear holocaust. So there was a very clear threat that everybody could understand that could be, you know, incinerated and then die from radiation, and it was a horrible death. In this case, just as an observation, the threat seems much more vague. It's one thing to have cops come into your home and raid and take your stuff. That's concrete, you can understand, but that happens very rarely if you look at the population. So I guess the question is, what is the real palpable threat image from this rather abstract entities that,
That's a great question. It's one that privacy scholars talk a lot about. Another area that I work on is domestic drone policy, and like, boy, do people get worked up about domestic drones. And and right now, it's like the NSA is capturing the records of every one of your calls. That's a huge thing. And there are like 2 police agencies that have drones. You won't contact one for the next year or 5 years or 10 years, but they can visualize the harm. They can visualize it's a flying death robot, and that is more. I mean, it's a lot more palpable than these kinds of programs that with code names where they gathered data that's already standing around in different places, and I think that's a real PR problem. I think it's something that has made it difficult to talk about this. And to go back a little bit to talking about how Orwell is our biggest is the thing that you can relate to. I think in many ways it doesn't work as well as saying there are people in a giant red country over there that have all their freedom taken away, and you want to be like that, do you? I think it's harder to say, well, a guy like 60 years ago wrote a book that ended really badly. But it's real, and so that's difficult. And in some ways, it makes me think that it may not be that we get the changes we want through a popular uprising demanding it. It may be that you have to make a rational argument about it, and that's why I think EFF has for a long time pursued this in the courtroom. That you don't have to convince 100 million people to protest in the streets. You have to convince a judge that this is illegal. And so I think that's one way in which that program is going to work a lot better.
I think that maybe there can also be a connection in terms of that question or comment as to what the threat is in looking at what you talked about before with regards to criminal justice. and that the United States right now has the largest prison population in the history of the planet. We have over 2.3 billion people behind bars. There are 500,000 people in prison right now who haven't even stood for a trial. So if there's something to be frightened about with regards to abuse of power, all we have to do is look at our jails. And what are the reasons why those people are in prison? Well, we've got drug laws, we've got all kinds of laws that come up, but it's the boogeyman. Whatever it is, it's the Red Scare. We can put it in that category of paranoia. So that's my comment. My question is, are there any representatives or politicians or organizations such as yourself that we can get behind who are representing a real concern for what privacy means to us? And I think we all agree that it's a basic human right.
Sure. I think, I will plug EFF. I've been working there 2 years, and I absolutely so deeply admire the institutional commitment to that sort of thing. There are also some politicians. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon has been over and over really hammering that point home. And it was a question from him that got our director of national intelligence caught in a bald-faced lie, where he said something, and then Snowden documents later proved that what he said was completely false, that he said this to Congress. So I think that there are groups there. And yeah, I think that supporting those kinds of groups is kind of the best you can do at this point. It's in the 70s, the last time we had a really major conversation about privacy in this country, it was we had the church committee that came together, and Frank Church led that, and a lot of the major famous quotes we have about, if the NSA is allowed to turn its eye on Americans, then people will have no place to hide, was the quote. And I think that that's something we've been pushing for, to see something like that and really get senators and congressmen on the record and investigating this. And I think that's something that would be a really major place that we could push for change.
I think people are asking you this question in different ways, but I'm going to do it again. So basically, this is, you were saying, people are always asking you, why should I care? And, if I'm not a criminal, then what is there to be afraid of? And I think, I think you're trying to answer this question in different ways, but I also think that there are people who think that there is a good reason. I'm not one of them, but there are many, many people who think there's a good reason to have this kind of spying program because there are terrorists among us, and look at 9/11, and we're basically at perpetual war because the U.S. is now in grave danger, which we didn't know before that, and now we need to be on constant alert, and that's what the DHS is for, and all this sort of stuff, right? So, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand how you navigate that mentality when people are like, well, I actually think this is better for me to give up my privacy so that I'm not in danger.
Yeah, so I think you're right. That's a question that people are coming at from different angles. And I think it's really hard. The deck is kind of stacked at people who against people who make a rational argument here. For example, someone mentioned nuclear holocaust before as the threat we were facing. That's an existential threat. I mean, if every city in your country is incinerated, that is it's hard to recover from that. Terrorism has never posed that sort of existential threat to the U.S. It's a real thing, but we're talking about the number of people killed by terrorists per year in the last up since 9/11 is fewer than the number of people killed by police officers in the U.S. And it's not, and of course the intelligence agencies say, well, yeah, it's because we were surveilling you. But that's I think really the onus has to change from us saying no, it's not about us demonstrating that we have nothing to hide or that we should have to hide something or that we shouldn't. What it should be, if a government wants to operate a program like this, if a government wants to invade and abridge this right that we consider a human right that many people think is very important, then it should have to justify it. And in fact, the ODNI, especially early in the program, early in the leaks, was saying, well, this is very important, and in fact, we've stopped or intercepted many terrorist acts because of this. And then people said, okay, like what? And they said, well, there was this one with the New York City subway, and journalists did some digging, and they said, no, actually, that was stopped with like conventional investigation measures. And so I think really the onus has to switch. If the government wants this program, they need to say, this is an existential threat that we're intercepting, and they need to explain why that's happening. And we have a say because it's our government, and we pay their salaries, and they're doing it in our name. I don't think that's where the conversation sits right now, but I think we have to get there. And finally, I don't want to spend too much time responding to nothing to hide because if you're still saying I've got nothing to hide at this point, then I just don't think I'll get through to you. But really, the point of that, the thing that really irks me there is that it's such a deeply narcissistic thing to say, that I have nothing to hide, and so therefore the government can invade everybody's rights. You're not allowed to trade that way. It's like, I don't mind getting groped, and so everybody, so it's game on for groping. It's really the people in this country who have something to hide are, maybe it's they have something legitimate to hide. Maybe it's the 500,000 people in prison who haven't yet faced trial, or maybe it's the people who are from historically disenfranchised groups. Maybe it's people who just the fact that they speak with their relatives in countries that they've left is considered suspicious, or historically maybe it's been their sexual orientation or their religious beliefs, or there's been a long history of things that people have had to hide that are not wrongdoing. And so I think again I know it looks like I'm yelling at you and you're yeah, and it's a boogeyman, and it's really like if they. Yeah, well, sure, and with they've said that the leak of the fact that they're doing this dragnet surveillance is a great harm to our tactical abilities, and that the government says this and it doesn't get critically questioned. I understand how we're investigating this person or this method is compromised. Might be considered of tactical importance, but the fact that they're spying on everybody is somehow going to change people's behavior in a way that would be bad. It just doesn't make sense, and we grant them the ability to just wave their arms and say this has to be secret and we have to do this, and otherwise 9/11.
You were talking earlier about how you wouldn't expect change to come through a popular uprising, but I think one of the great successes that happened recently was the SOPA PIPA, like the online protests and the blackouts of WikiLeaks. Do you think something like that could also happen for the NSA issues? And then, in addition to that, what can we as Californians and constituents of Dianne Feinstein do to push this agenda?
So I worked a lot on SOPA PIPA, and I absolutely, as a guy who's followed copyright policy for a long time, was floored to see that level of popular opposition, and I loved it. It was really an amazing thing. I don't mean that, if we can get that, great. One of the things that really helped in that effort was when companies like Google took part, and companies like Google took part in that. In part, I think that they were convinced by the arguments, but in part, it also would render their businesses inoperable, and we're only starting to see that with the NSA. I think people actually voting with their dollars would get companies on board, and companies can be a real multiplier and get that to be a popular opposition thing. And I don't mean to say that it's not going to happen through popular opposition. I just want to say that we shouldn't wait for that. We shouldn't hold our breath and say, well, only if X number of people get involved is this considered wrong? Because I think you can look at it and any rational person can see why it's wrong. Yeah, I think that.
What about the Feinstein? Do we as Californians have any?
Yeah, I mean, vote her out if you can. It's really been on this issue in particular, and that's how I see her. There's no greater apologist for these programs in the public eye, more than the president, more than Clapper. She's been a voice of saying these are really important, and it's really, I'm a California too. I live in San Francisco. It's embarrassing. This is not what a public official should be doing. I write regularly. I get responses back. She doesn't agree with me. I encourage you to as well. I mean, politics is tough. She's been there a long time, and even like we saw this with SOPA, there were people who sponsored that then faced challenges, and the challengers didn't really make it onto the radar. That actually electing a person or getting a person not elected is really, really hard. But I do think that to the extent that we can register opposition, and especially to people outside of California, and so I understand many of you are in California right now, if they can get their representatives if they know that they've got backing so that they can have the guts to stand up to Feinstein, who at this point seems like, I hope not, but sort of a lost cause on these issues, then that's really what we need. She's one senator, and there are many others. Yeah, we have at EFF.org/action. We've got a place where you can contact your senators and representatives right now. We've got one to say, I don't believe we've got one about the USA Freedom Act. We have one that says specifically oppose Feinstein's fake fix, and really this is something that they need to hear, because it's going to be pitched over and over as, she's on the Intelligence Committee, she really understands these issues, this is a fix, and they need to hear this is a fake fix that needs to be shut down. All right. Are there any other questions? All right. Thank you. There's an art show downstairs, and I encourage everyone to check it out. Thank you.